Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and your latest on this coronavirus crisis. I would say that the single thing that I've been thinking about, talking about, that's probably attracted the most controversy, gotten the most attention, has been the question of the United States and the West versus China coming out of this crisis. Are the Chinese going to look stronger? Are they going to look weaker? Right. And I mean, it's an interesting question because obviously a global recession, a sharp recession, hurts everyone. So nobody benefits from that. The Chinese, of course, are already a poorer economy, a smaller economy than that of the United States. The U.S. economy has more resilience. But the U.S. has also really abdicated on the global stage. There's very little leadership that's being shown by the Trump administration or by the U.S. more broadly in how other countries should respond to this crisis. America First is really America at home in the response to the biggest crisis since World War II. And you notice these things. I mean, I've been writing about a GZERO world, an absence of U.S. global leadership for almost a decade now, but you don't notice it as much when you're not in a crisis, because, I mean, if you're standing on a pier and the supports are eroding, but it's relatively calm waters, you don't necessarily think, oh my God, this pier could wash away. But suddenly you get one big storm and there's no pier, right? And that's kind of what this global crisis looks like. It makes you really question, how well does American democracy function? How well is it a representative democracy for the average American? Is it fit for purpose? Are other systems more effective? Now, on the one hand, it's very clear that a surveillance state, a technologically empowered authoritarian regime, has some pretty significant built-in advantages to respond to a pandemic, right? You can track all your people. You can make sure that they comply with your authority. You tell them you will socially distance or else. In Italy, in the United States, a lot of people say, I don't really want to do that. You might have a fine. In China, it's a very different story, right? And they will not only monitor you at your workplace or in public parks, but they can monitor you in every building. There's an extraordinary level of data concentration in smartphones, in just a couple of apps that the average Chinese citizen already conducts everything on. I mean, the digital Chinese economy is 50 times the size of the digital U.S. economy, even though the American economy is bigger. And the reason for that is because no one uses credit cards, right? Everyone's paying with their smartphone and everyone's doing everything with their smartphone, which means you've got built-in tracking. Now, that is the way that the Americans and Europeans are going to go, right? I mean, Google today has the ability to geo-track individuals. They're doing it anonymously in the way that they give that data to the government or they make that data public, but they have the information. And that means they can see real time where social distancing policies are working and where they're not. In very short order, you'll have the ability for technology companies to develop functional apps that will be secure as anything is in this cyber, sort of dangerous age, that will allow you to see and authorities to see who has gotten coronavirus and tested for it, who has not, right? Therefore, who has some level of immunity, and we don't yet know how much immunity, who has not, who is presently symptomatic, who has not, and track exactly where they are all the time, what buildings they're going in, what buildings they're not allowed in. And most Americans and Europeans that are being polled are basically saying, yeah, we want that. We want that. That's going to help our economy get back up to speed. And I got to tell you, 3 months, 6 months time, when we still have a lot of mandatory social distancing going on, I mean, we won't be under lockdown, God forbid, but we will still be living very differently than we were living just 2 months ago. the vast majority are going to say, oh, that's fine. We'll just live with not having the privacy. We just want to be able to get back to work. We want our kids to go to school. We want to have our lives back, right? And if that means giving up some of our liberties, well, after 9/11, we were willing to give up some of our liberties. The Patriot Act, the security, the TSA in airports, for example, the surveillance on communications, something we all willingly supported because we were really concerned about terrorists perpetrating another act like 9/11. I personally believe that the pendulum swung too far and that the costs, both in terms of personal liberty and also the economic costs, those resources could have been spent much more effectively on improvements of the collective American well-being than they actually were. And I'm not even talking about Afghanistan or Iraq here, but nonetheless, you understand the trade-off. That trade-off is coming in the United States and in Europe too. But does that suddenly mean that the Americans and Europeans are going to feel like authoritarian regimes? No, I wouldn't make that argument. I think rule of law and the independent judiciary is still very much here. So I don't believe that there is a moral equivalence that will come even after this crisis between the United States and China. But I do think that the argument that is made that the Americans are leading the world by example is actually getting harder to make. And it was already getting more challenging. I mean, I do believe that American exceptionalism in its best manifestations was something that was good to believe in, certainly with the Marshall Plan after World War II and the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization. NATO, those are institutions that are better for the world having had them. And the Berlin Wall coming down. I mean, my first trip to the Soviet Union was in 1986. And I really believe that the American system was structurally better in almost every way than the Soviet system. Absolutely. In ways that, say, Bernie Sanders wasn't necessarily as convinced back then. And I believed that it was because our ideas were better, was because our conception of personal liberties and of the way a free market economy regulated should run, that the average Soviet and the average person living under dictatorship in the Eastern Bloc wanted to remove those chains and wanted independence, wanted the end of the Soviet empire, which I think was, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union was an unmitigated positive for the world, and certainly most importantly for the people living under it. But I think that over the last 20 years, when you look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when you look at the issues around the 2008 financial crisis and the lack of support for a lot of people that were left behind while the banks and Detroit were bailed out, the growing, yawning inequality inside the United States, the sense that the system is rigged in favor of 10% of Americans who have both the education, but critically, the access to gatekeepers, the network effect that allows them to succeed while more and more are left behind. And so many more will be left behind as a consequence of this crisis. I believe America's moral authority, its ability to lead by example, is being compromised very structurally. And that's even before you talk about President Trump, who I haven't mentioned yet in this conversation, even before you talk about America first, even before you talk about a president who is much more unilateralist and transactional in the way he thinks about alliances. Now, the alternative to the U.S., for some countries, will be a little bit more China. For some countries, it will be the fact that the Chinese have Belt and Road, which is nothing close to the Marshall Plan and comes with conditionality that will be problematic for a lot of countries. But it's more than nothing. And, I think when the Americans are abdicating leadership and what they're really doing is saying, if you don't follow us, we're going to beat you up, we're going to sanction you, we're not going to share intelligence. In other words, the U.S. is really wielding a stick, but there's very little carrot. There's in this coronavirus, the worst crisis we've seen since World War II, the Americans are offering allies very little carrot, almost none. While the Chinese, their carrot may be small, it may be rotted, but there's a carrot. And I think that a lot of countries that look at, there's humanitarian aid, and we're saying, well, a lot of it doesn't work. Well, there's medical personnel. Well, they're not doing very much. I think a lot of countries are going to say, well, what's our alternative? Chinese 5G. Yeah, they're going to get our data, but the Americans will get our data too. And it's cheaper if it's Chinese, and they're doing stuff for us right now. It's not clear to me, especially when the Americans are no longer being trusted as living up to the values that we espouse at home and globally. It's not clear to me that we have the moral authority to convince allies to align with us. And that means the Chinese will pick up more ground. Now, one thing I have not yet said, and which merits being said, is that all of this still came from China. It's because the Chinese covered up the virus to begin with that we got the initial explosion. 5 million Chinese traveling from Wuhan in the initial month across China and all over the world. 500,000 of them almost traveling outside China, that we got the explosion. And yes, the Americans and Europeans responded late and responded inadequately. But the original sin of this pandemic comes from China. And there are those who believe that there will be inquiries and investigations and that is going to make the Chinese look much weaker coming out of this crisis. My response to that is it's possible. But at a time when the global economy will be contracting, and especially when poor countries are facing an absence of economic support, financial systems in free fall, and are desperate to get anything, I think that their willingness to not pay a lot of attention to what the Chinese did or didn't do at the beginning of 2020, and instead focus on what are you doing for me lately, is likely to win out, is likely to be more significant. Again, let's keep in mind, I don't think the Chinese are close to supplanting the United States as the global superpower. Their military spending is nowhere close. The United States outspends the next 7 countries combined. The U.S. has a global footprint. The Chinese footprint is only regional. America's diplomatic corps is still a hell of a lot larger than China's is. And again, you still, despite everything I said about lack of leading by example, there still is not moral equivalence between a system that has rule of law and independent judiciary, no matter how flawed, and the system that you presently have in China, authoritarian and state capitalist. What I am saying is that we're going to have much more of a power vacuum. There's going to be an absence of global leadership. And in an absence, in that vacuum, the Chinese will be able to take more advantage. They'll have more influence than they did, and collective humanity is going to be the poorer for it. So a few thoughts going into this long weekend, which is probably not going to feel like much of a long weekend, but take of it what you can. I hope everyone is safe and home and with their families and their loved ones, and I'll see you all next week.